Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Last week, we began to think about specific social issues with an introduction to immigration and the Bible. Today, we're going to take a little of what we learned to help us think about how Christians can understand the current political realities around immigration with our guest, Steve Eng. Steve Eng is the Advocacy Director for the National Association of Evangelicals. Through this role, Steve works with NAE leaders, constituents, and others to help advance the principles of the NAE document for the health of the nation and to help these groups understand how they can use their God-given influence in the public square. Before joining the NAE, Steve served for 3 decades as an ordained evangelical pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. He received a degree in political science from St. Olaf College and an MDiv degree from North Park Theological Seminary. While our conversation concludes with current political realities around immigration, we begin with a foundational look at how Christians can interact with the government and political systems, the role the church has to play, and how much influence individuals really can have at a federal level. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Steve Eng. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Steve, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely.
So, like I just said, I go through the intro separately, so people will already have heard that you're the advocacy director for the NAE, but I'm curious if you could kind of tell people what that consists of. What does your job look like? Maybe sort of like at a high level role, things you do.
Yeah, I'm part of a government relations team at the National Association of Evangelicals, and some people think we're primarily an advocacy organization, but really we primarily resource and connect evangelical leaders and other evangelicals on a variety of different issues, and that can include evangelism and discipleship and the life of the church, and there's even been things on worship or the role of AI. Our last magazine was on that. Um, but within our sort of government relations civic function, and let me just add parenthetically that the NAE does a lot of work in public theology, and so and really, or another way of saying that is really what are the public implications of our discipleship? Because while the Christian faith is deeply personal, it's also never private, and I think sometimes in our world today where we're overwhelmed with so much coming at us from so many different directions and some increased kind of intensity of differing opinions on issues, it's easy to just retreat into what feels normal or personal or private in our faith. But we really believe that the Christian faith and the lordship of Jesus impacts all areas of life, that Jesus is Lord over all creation. And so we want to be about not only our own personal spiritual growth and the thriving of our churches, but just the thriving of humanity, the flourishing of all humans, to be pursuing the common good. Our tagline is influence for good, and sometimes people use the word favor, and God's given us favor or influence, and he calls us to be good stewards of that, and that includes advocacy. So our government relations work has existed for virtually 80 years because we were evangelicals who were not afraid to engage in issues of the day while also still remaining rooted in the scriptures and focused on the gospel, but that there's a sort of a comprehensiveness to the gospel that touches all areas of life. So there's always been a government relations function. And for a lot of times, for many years, that was one person representing the NAE in Washington, D.C., to the White House, to the Supreme Court, and to Congress. And that team has grown a little bit over the last several years. And so, in addition to a policy and advocacy manager who helps in D.C. with D.C. facing meetings and networking, um, then I was brought on 4.5 years ago now, um, after really a career in local church ministry in an evangelical church, um, to to really discuss and talk about and raise awareness of the policy work that we are doing in Washington, D.C. at the federal level. We care about what's happening at state and local levels, but our staff is fairly small, so we have the bandwidth just to kind of do the best we can to work on the federal level. Um, but so a lot of that's communicating what we're doing, but it's also really educating pastors in what's the biblical call to advocacy. That there is that call in Proverbs 31 to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, to ensure justice for those who are crushed, and we see that pattern of advocacy throughout the scriptures, and we can get into that more a little later. But uh, it's talking to pastors. We have 8 different sort of spheres of civic engagement in our document for the health of the nation. The subtitle is An Evangelical Call to Civic Responsibility. And so we raise awareness of those issues that we feel are biblically driven issues, and that would include sanctity of life, religious freedom, supporting marriages, families, and children, seeking justice and compassion for the poor and vulnerable, preserving human rights, pursuing racial justice and reconciliation, promoting peace and restraining violence, and caring for God's creation. I think that's all 8 of them. And so we talk about all those things. And then out of all of those areas, which are each one could take a lifetime to sort of unpack. I do a lot of work with seeking justice and compassion for the poor and vulnerable, and related issues on human rights and marriages, families, and kids. All of these issues are kind of interlocking, but things having to do with poverty, both here in the U.S. and abroad, um, immigration, and the need for immigration reform, and we're doing increasing work in global health as well, because America is such a key player in that. So that's what I do. I talk about what does the Bible have to say about the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the foreigner. What's the biblical call for advocacy? What are some trusted NAE resources? We have some fantastic resources, or our partners do, letting people know that there are good places to go to get better information, maybe than people's media outlet of choice. And also then, what are some tools? What are some ways that people can take action? What are some either personal coaching we can do with leaders, or just experiential learning opportunities to give people a taste for what does it mean to write or call or meet with a member of Congress, and those skills, advocacy skills that we help build, and we can unpack that more in a little bit, um, are things that could be enormously helpful for your school board meeting, or talking to a business leader in your community, or many other things as well. But just, what does it mean to sort of speak up in a way that builds bridges, advances causes, and lets people know that there's some people who don't have as much of a voice as some of us do, and to be a good steward of that.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot there that I think we'll jump back into
Yeah.
piece by piece here. I
Yeah.
think the first thing that caught my attention there was the call to evangelicals to focus on the public along with the private or the
Yeah.
personal, because I think maybe stereotypically evangelicals in particular have a pretty strong focus on the private, the internal faith, practice of things of that nature. Do you, what does it look like when you interact with churches? Does it take difficulty to get buy-in on public versus private? Is it different church by church, denomination by denomination? What does that look like?
It does differ by church and pastor and denomination, but I think generally, and having served local churches for years, there is no pastor I know who wants people at their church to get mad and leave. There's nobody who wants, or a nonprofit leader who wants donors to stop giving because they're offended. So I think that there's just a lot of fear and reticence to dive into anything that seems controversial. But that's the world we live in. Like, there's so many issues that people disagree on, so I don't think we can avoid that. So yeah, it depends. But I think as a general trend, I think there's, among many and desire to avoid um, engaging in the public square if at all possible. I was talking to somebody yesterday. I had run across an article maybe several months ago, um, talking about in really troubled times. And the phrase that this article talked about was hyper normalization. So when we are overwhelmed by so many things going on all at once and life is tough, I think our innate human desire is to try to pretend like everything's normal and to try to find that normal. And so I think that it's a very strong pull to just retreat from really important things that we ought to be engaging in. And it was this article talked about that happened during the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In those countries, some that was happening in the 1920s with the emergence in 30s in Nazi Germany, that people just didn't want to see what was right in front of them, and so they would, and I think we've even seen that in the American story, with the flight to the suburbs, because we didn't really want to deal with the tough issues that cities were dealing with, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Um, the whole evangelical movement is, for a long time, has been largely a suburban movement because I think we all want to be comfortable. And so, and I
Yeah.
don't say that to be condemning because I mean, that's part of my own story too, so, um, but just to be able to name that and say that as much as we want things to be normal, I don't think in human history things have been normal. And I don't think there's been, um, you know, ever an excuse or a reason to escape. But we understand when people want to do that. So that's just the tension that we live with, But I think once people understand that, it's either somebody they know, their neighbor, somebody in their church who's impacted by, say, policy, um, if it's, somebody in their own family who's being affected, um, or just the scripture call is so clear, to be engaged that I think following Jesus means going into the hard places rather than running away from the hard places. So,
Yeah.
so I just think that's the tension of our discipleship as followers of Jesus.
Yeah. A couple things there I want to hit on. One, I think it's good to call out what is normal. Like
Right?
normal is different for different people. And
Yeah.
so someone wanting to retreat into their normal is not necessarily what is normal for people who are experiencing whatever they might be experiencing.
Yeah.
Another thing I think it's worth pointing out is that you hit on the like people kind of retreating in some of these like really like severe, maybe might be the right word, situations of like the fall of the USSR or in the rise of Nazi Germany. But then also you point out as people are sort of doing that in the United States with moving to the suburbs, which has seems to have much lower stakes. And I think it's helpful to see that like this doesn't just happen in times of crisis. This like is a thing that happens as we are looking to, as you said, sort of maintain this comfortable position. And so just for anyone who's listening, I want us to realize that this doesn't just happen at big moments. I know that a lot of people feel like right now we are in a very big, elevated moment in our country, but it doesn't just happen at those points.
I was talking to somebody a couple of years ago. I live in Minnesota. Let's just call it a state to the west of us here, and this person was saying, "Oh, we are having so many people moving to our state, for really political, cultural reasons." And while we're having this conversation, I'm having this conversation about, I would love to come out to your part of your state and just start some conversations on immigration. And it's like, no, people don't want to talk about that. People don't want to, these people who are coming to our country, and And in the same breath, he was saying people from other parts of the US, like California, were moving to the state because they were escaping, And I said, well, actually, that sounds like internal migration, right, within the United States, because we do that all the time. We move from one part of the country or one part of a state to another because it's just a better life. We perceive that. And so I said, basically, you don't want to talk about what everybody's doing. People are just migrating within the US rather than, from other countries to the US. And yeah, I don't know if that irony was completely, grasped at that point, but it was an aha moment for me, about again, we sometimes condemn those who seem other than us, when we, as by human nature, do the very same things, So
Yeah, uh, I think that's a great point as well. And I can't help but mention now we're both in Minnesota right now, and we're in a border state. Like we
yeah,
don't think about that because Canada feels so similar to the United States, but it is a different country, and we're in a border state, and so and we have so much commerce as Minnesota with Canada that this is not the place we need to go to, but it's what's top of mind after that comment of, and also having been a person who's moved across the country, like this happens. This is life. This is how humans function, is moving into places. But we can come back to some of those things in a
sure,
moment.
sure, yeah, yeah,
Uh, I wonder if we can dive into thinking about advocacy, uh, and sort of thinking of it in the way that your role functions, because I think we can think of, or I can think of, I guess, advocacy as going to our elected officials, advocating
right.
for policies, things of that nature, which is a piece of advocacy. But it sounds like you're primarily going into churches and not approaching uh, politicians necessarily. What is the work of advocacy that the church has? What is the church's role in advocacy? What does that look like?
I think it starts, and this is not original to me, but I think it starts with moving to places where people are struggling. And by moving, I mean that could be a outreach ministry, that could be a neighborhood you live in, walking across the street. The word that is often used is proximity. We need to be close to people. We need to be proximate to people who have different life experiences than us. And so historically, not all churches, but a lot of churches have done really rather well in compassion ministries. Who are the hungry, who are the people who are struggling. I was in Western Minnesota for years, and we did a lot of ministries, with recovery ministries, with ex-offenders, people who've gone through treatment, who are looking for a next step. And those were kind of people on the margins of those communities. And I just consistently found that there was so much life that people who have struggled, it's right out of the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit. So those who know they need God, will find God and see God, and we tend to see God in them. And so it really starts with that initial movement towards people who maybe have less or have had harder experiences in life. And then what you discover in that journey is that, it's not like a one-way street, like I'm going to give them everything that they don't have. We find in the midst of that we find Jesus, and that those we serve are serving us, and that it's a very mutual thing. So advocacy starts with just, going across the street. In one church, in Western Minnesota that I served, it became very apparent that our churches were successful people came to worship and network for business, and everything felt a bit like a country club. And uh, and uh, and then realized that there's a whole element of that community who was struggling with alcohol or drugs, or had been in and out of jail or prison. In another community I lived in, the church was right across the street from the like second largest elementary school in the state of Minnesota. And I started talking to people about, well, what's happening at that school and what have you done at the school? And they're kind of like, what school? I'm like, it's the one right across the street from the church. And so we began talking to the principal and talking to teachers, and what is it that you need, and discovered that in that district, in that school, there's a lot of underserved students, and they needed lots of school supplies. And so we did big, huge gift baskets of school supplies for the teachers, and I mean, I was in that community for several years. That's been continuing for 7 or 8 years since then. And there's teachers who come to know Jesus because of that, literally walking across the street and doing something unexpected and just demonstrating the love of God, so advocacy starts with that, and then what we find is that oftentimes when you get to know people, you find that my charitable contribution, my gift only goes so far, that there are structural things or bigger issues in their life. And some of those issues are policy issues. It may be the way that poverty supports are set up. It may be the presence of or the lack of drug treatment. There may be criminal justice issues. There may be immigration policy issues, and so at some point when you start to get deeper into people's lives, you realize that there are some barriers that are policy barriers that we need to speak up, and that could be local zoning, that could be, inequities in the school system, or that could be federal policy. So then, because I think until people really know that, first of all, people different than me are human and are loved by God and have great dignity, we don't get very far. But once people realize that, then they start to become aware of these larger sort of systemic issues. And then there's some motivation to get involved in that. But I think for a lot of people then, um, they need to be given permission that this is okay for Christians to get
Mm,
involved in these
yeah.
spaces. You're not being, but you might show up to your Bible study a little less often, or you might not go to this church social event because you're out in the community doing stuff that really matters. And the churches need to bless that and give permission that that is a huge part of following Jesus, and that and then understand that certain things, like meeting with an elected official, the vast majority of people have never done that before. It feels scary. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to write a letter, where to write it. And so then to be able to help, if that's church members or pastors or nonprofit leaders, like, here's a simple online tool. Here are some sample letters that are fully editable that you can write. Here's a paragraph that sets up the issue so you can speak intelligently about it. Here's the phone number of the Capitol switchboard. um, once people start doing that, you're like, oh, okay, let's have a meeting with an elected official, and so it might be a key person in that church, or it might be somebody like me or one of our regional people who say, hey, we'll help you set up that meeting. I'll go with you. Let's practice how to do this. And once you start doing these things, you realize, first of all, that some of the people you meet with are mostly in their 20s, and so they're the same age or younger than those who are meeting with them. They're not very intimidating. You find out that their job is actually to listen to you, and they're not hostile for the most part. And it's just lowering these barriers, because I think for all of us, none of us wants to do something we've never done before, so if we can be guides in that process, that's enormously helpful for people to kind of lower those barriers and give people those experiences. And then at some point, people are like, well, I can do that. That's not that hard. And I remind them, because I was a local church pastor for many years, that you don't have to do this every day of the week, every month of the year.
Yeah.
If you reach out, several letters a year, even if you just find the sample letter, click send, or just change two sentences in the letter to personalize it. Um, I can do that. I don't even have to look up the address. The NAE has a tool for that. Or oh, I mean, or meeting with elected officials, like, oh, I can do that. And maybe it starts with your council person or somebody in the school board, but it's also not that hard. And most people don't even know where their congressional offices are. Well, we could just help you. And is even though it's so easy on Google now to just find anything, people just need that nudge, and so if we can do that. And for people who say, well, this is a distraction from our work, our gospel work, and like, you certainly can pray with elected officials or their staff, you can talk about what Jesus means to you, who he means to you, you can actually share your faith, it's just taking it out of our comfortable worship services and Bible studies and Christian circles, or our next door neighbors, which is really important, but also taking it into more public places and say, and part of it is, I mean, there's a time to share the four spiritual laws with somebody, um, but sometimes I think people who don't know Jesus need to know that Christians actually care and that Christians
Yeah,
want to see things just and fair, and Christians aren't just out for themselves, because there's a lot of that.
right.
Forget if whether that's true or not. And But that Christians actually care, and so it's a wonderful way to open up the conversation about who Jesus is and why Jesus drives us to care and to advocate to until Jesus comes again, to work towards a better world and to work towards a world where Jesus really is Lord over many spheres of our culture and society.
Yeah. And I think I consistently think of folks would advocate for themselves. And if it's something that you care about for yourself, is there something that you can care about for someone else as well? And it would be the same process of advocating for yourself as for advocating for your neighbor.
Absolutely, Eric, that's a really good point. I remember when I first started, one person who I didn't spend a lot of time with, but had such a powerful witness that I was trying to learn from her any chance I could. But there's a woman named Dr. Joanne Lyon. She was for many years the general superintendent of the Wesleyan Church, and she's been a long time member of the RNAE board. And Joanne would take pastors to Washington D.C. and she'd say it was they were so struck as they're in the waiting rooms waiting to meet with a staffer or a member of Congress, um, that there'd be a whole group of people coming out of the office and they were like snowmobile dealers, or there's another group who came out and they were like beer distributors or something, and there's all these lobbying groups, like you say, lobbying for themselves, and so to come in and say, actually, we're not here for ourselves today. We're here for others and those who maybe are forgotten or don't have a voice. We were in a meeting 6 months ago, Washington, D.C. We're meeting with a Republican staffer on the Senate Finance Committee because not only does each member of Congress have staff, but the committees in Congress have their own staff. And this guy was said, I'm in meetings every day with a room full of economists making, fiscal policy, tax policy for the United States. They're all making $250,000 a year, making decisions on things that they know nothing about. And he said, and the faith community is not at the table. He said, and so I'm so glad you're here today. And it was us as the NAE and also some mainliners and Catholics and others who were at the table. And so we need to hear from you, because again, everybody tends to come with their hat in their hand for themselves in DC, and to come really saying, no, there's other people who would never come, uh, but they need to be remembered. So
Yeah. I also, as you were talking, was doing the math in my head of how many letters equals a certain amount. And uh, if you just sent a letter to each of your senators and your representative at the federal level, that's 3 letters. You do that 3 times a year, it's 9 letters. And so like we can think of like, oh, I'm doing so much work putting this in. If you send just a couple letters at one time, that counts. And so like
it
if you
it
send 10
does.
letters in a year, that's less than one a month.
And in our tool, when you write a letter and you even personalize it, it automatically gets sent to both of your senators and your representatives. So right there, boom, in 5 minutes, you've sent 3 letters with one click of the button. So um, yeah, yeah. So that's, and then, and if there's like 20 people, contacting a congressional office on a particular issue, we've been told that that then puts it on their radar screen. There's also sort of a hierarchy of effectiveness. So a form letter is maybe 10% effective, a personalized letter is maybe 20% effective, a phone call maybe is 30% effective, and a meeting in person with a staffer, or then obviously the gold standard is meeting with the actual member of Congress themselves. It's like 85% effective. And so, and again, we can't always do in-person meetings, but if we can, then that's certainly more effective than a form letter. Um, but it's a combination of quality and quantity that ultimately matters. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So, uh, you mentioned that the NAE mostly does work at the federal level, which to me makes sense as a national organization that you'd be
yeah.
working at that level. And uh, I have had different episodes of this podcast where we've been focusing on what are you doing locally. Federal is not the only place where this work happens, and we just kind of talked about that. But that doesn't mean we can ignore what's happening federally. What does what sort of impact can a person have on what is happening federally? So when a person sends a letter or if they meet with their representative, what how does that impact what is happening at a federal level?
I have a short answer and a long answer for that. And in some ways, I think one of my biggest challenges is people say, what's the point? The system is broken. Why should I even waste my time especially at the federal level? I think that's why increasingly policy is being passed at the state and local level. And so, that's super important. I don't want to minimize that. Um, I, I just tell people it's because I think God wants us at those tables, with the snowmobile dealers and with the beer distributors. And God wants us to speak truth to power. And you look at Moses and you look at Esther and you look at Nehemiah, and you could say they were doing federal level policy. I mean, they were talking to the heads of state. And so there's biblical precedent for that. Paul appealing to Caesar. Um, so I just think that we just need to. It's so broken that I just think we need as many Christians as possible to have a direct, clear, loving, and thoughtful and winsome witness occasionally at the federal level as well. It's tough being an elected official. Sometimes it's to be a word of encouragement for a staffer or um, a member of Congress trying to do the right thing who are faced with umpteen million different requests, a lot of anger. It's just like pastoral care, for members at the federal level, because it's such a mess. And so, on one level, that's part of it. It's sharing our witness, um, that we follow Jesus and what Jesus has done for us. But it's also being a moral conscience that sometimes we have to say, we didn't elect you to just run for the next election, to stay in power. We elected you to govern. And so we want to help you and come alongside you with actually governing. My friend Greg Baker in Iowa says that a lot. He's with the family leader, and just reminding elected officials that we've called you to govern, and how can we pray for you? I brought uh, a college president from Alaska to meet with their senators and their representative, and we walked in the office, and one of the senators said, "Pastor Keith, great to see you. I just read your devotional this week." And here he writes a devotional, blind carbon copy, to his members of Congress and probably some key state legislators, some key local legislators. They don't know who gets this letter, but he does a devotional every week. And the senator said, "I just read your devotional this week, and that was really meaningful to me." And then after we were done with our policy conversation, a couple of us dismissed ourselves, and my friend Pastor Keith met with the senator and they prayed together, they shared stuff. I mean, that's the kind of relationships that can sometimes happen. um, Senator Langford in Oklahoma, he back in the day was a Baptist youth pastor, but he has developed relationships with some core people who have him on their speed dial, and he actually welcomes their contact and will reach out to them for prayer and for counsel. And so somebody needs to do that. And why not have really solid, healthy, mature Christians, and not to stroke our own egos, but just say there's a need for some people like
Right.
that, and maybe that's you. I mean, it's One of our senators, I mean, I have a long ways to go with that relationship, but we've had a couple conversations because we went to the same high school, so
Oh,
I
nice.
mean, you never know just the points of connection, and we had like just a real human level conversation, and was just able to thank the senator for some good things that the senator's done. It's just a source of encouragement. So it's not impossible. It doesn't happen every day, but again, just having that voice occasionally, I just think is really important. The old adage was all politics is local, and I totally get that. The local trickled up to the federal. The new adage is all politics is national, and so really because it's so much dominated by the rhetoric of certain politicians or parties that you really have to kind of be at the active at the federal level in order to influence the conversations all the way down to your local school board. And so my boss has had, and I don't think this is like speaking out of turn, but it's had, I think, two suppers. He's actually cooked dinner for a key person in the White House, and starting a relationship where that person in the White House is like, oh, okay, well, actually, I'm seeing some things cross some people's desk. I'm wondering what that's about. And so like some of the really big issues we're working on, it starts with somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, and it starts with an invitation to a meal, and and as we speak, some of the rules of how advocacy has worked are changing because I would say Congress, in a lot of ways, has been abdicating their responsibility to govern, and so more and more and more is coming from the executive branch, and that's happened in both parties. But that's kind of our new thing to figure out is how, and that's maybe we're going to have to be sort of scouts and guides along the way to help people. But, increasingly, you'll see for us letters that are not only addressed to members of Congress, but addressed, for instance, to the State Department or to the White House or whatever. So these are different times than we've lived in as far as even how to do political advocacy. Um, but we all just need to kind of learn. And again, I don't expect everybody to be deeply involved in all of this, but come with us once to DC, come with us once to an experiential learning experience like at the border, you know, um, you know, we'll work with you or other local partners to make sure that you have at least one face-to-face meeting with a federal, official or their staff. And that could just be in your town or two towns over, where their office is. So it starts with that.
Yeah. And I love those stories that you provided. And the one thing that strikes me about the story of Pastor Keith in particular is that even if he hadn't met with the public official, he was still having an impact. And so if he had never met and didn't know, he was still having an impact. And so I think that just shows that you can have an impact even if you don't see it happening or you don't realize that it's happening.
Yeah, I had a similar story with a large church pastor in North Dakota, and we brought him into DC. And as soon as we walked in the door, there's a small group of us. One of their senators said, "Pastor Paul," he said, and I don't know if he went to that church, but he certainly knew him because of the pastor's, I think his engagement in the community in North Dakota, some in the Fargo area. And just because that pastor was really engaged in civic things, that got the attention of one of their senators. And so when he walked in the door, it was like old friends meeting. And it was very interesting. It was a kind of almost like a deferential thing. Like the senator was sort of like really respecting and looking up to the pastor, because of his engagement in his community and the quality of his ministry. And he had a lot of influence. So
Yeah. That's I love I love the stories and I love that like it's just another way to help people learn about what is possible.
yeah.
Uh, I wonder if we can turn the conversation now towards some of the issues that you engage with, that the NAE engages with. Uh, to me, if it was me trying to manage 8 different issues, it would feel like a lot for me. Do you find that it's hard to manage that many issues, or what does it look like to focus on a bunch of different things at the same time?
it is really hard because people build their career on a subset of one of those issues. Um, I think because at the NAE we are an association of our members. It's not all up to our staff. We are an associate. So, we have organizations like World Vision and World Relief and Compassion International and, some major players in international relief and development work. And they have their own networks and they have some of their advocacy. The Salvation Army is part of us. They have their own government relations team, because they're so large. And so, and so sometimes we just rely on people. We just want to bless them and be a resource. Um, but some things we do, like on sanctity of life and religious freedom, there are so many evangelical organizations working on those issues. There's whole very large denominations that's the only thing they work on, the sanctity of life and religious freedom. Um, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars going to those causes. So we feel like we don't have to replicate what's already happening because our staff is so much smaller and our budget's so much smaller. Um, but what we will do is we'll be very active, and this is more my boss, but lining up like friend of the Supreme Court briefs, amicus briefs. So most of the significant religious freedom issues that have come before the Supreme Court in the last probably 50 years, the NAE has weighed in on. And so there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that the average person wouldn't know about, but on those two issues especially. So, but there's only a fraction of that in the evangelical world going to advocating for defending the vulnerable. And so that's where I'm spending a lot more of my time. And again, immigration, just the whole topic of immigration, there's nothing more complicated in the United States. Immigration is probably number two to the U.S. tax code. So I mean, it's extremely complicated. But we just, we've said what's the lowest hanging fruit? What are the things that are most impacting, evangelicals, church members? What are the things that we really think we need to communicate at a biblical level? So we do. So I'm doing a lot of that. We've done quite a bit again with those who are lower income, struggling families. What are some family supportive policies that we think are effective that make sure that, because right now some things got passed this summer by Congress that looked really good on the face, but it left out the poorest people, and so, the benefits to the wealthy are very large, and your typical poor person is going to come out way worse, both in not getting the tax benefits as well as having, other supports cut. So, we feel like we need to be in that space. And like I say, right now we're doing some work with Global Health. World Relief is our subsidiary. It's had a huge impact on cuts in global health and development funding, foreign funding. And we feel like to whom much is given, much is expected, and that America has a role to play in that to really keep millions of people alive, strengthen our national security, and also and physical security, and it's just the right thing to do, So for a tiny fraction of our whole federal budget, so those are the things that, and we're just starting some work in global health, and so I have a pretty steep learning curve right now to understand some of the dynamics of that. So and like I told a medical missionary yesterday over coffee, I said, my goal is not to be the expert. That's your role to do that, um, I, but we can be a convener. We can bring the experts to the table to talk to people, to talk to members of Congress. We can bring the experts to the table to talk to churches, produce videos, produce some fact sheets. And right now, because nobody trusts the media, and because some of the systems for like reporting on what's happening around the world have completely collapsed this summer. We're having, part of our proposal with this funding we're about to get, is saying, we'll just have to collect firsthand stories of what our missionaries seeing on the field, because the evidence seems to suggest that millions of people will be dying because of decisions that were made in the last 6 months. Um, so we just feel compelled to be involved in that space as well. And but for me, it'll be learning as I'm going. My boss was with World Relief in Africa, in Indonesia, around the world for 17 years. So he deeply knows, you know, either how things operate overseas or knows people who are currently involved. So I'll be doing a lot of learning in the months ahead.
Yeah. I have felt I have felt that way myself in different things as the it almost feels like my opportunity to become an expert in something. Maybe there's still some possibility of that, but I've spent so much time as a generalist in my life
Yeah.
that like the decision to do that seems like it needed to happen 10 years ago or something. But parenthetically to something you said, I have really appreciated World Relief in the last year, really, and the work that they've been doing,
Yeah.
especially through social media and other forms of media, in providing resources for helping people understand what is happening, sort of in the work that they're doing.
Yeah. They do an
So,
outstanding job. Yeah.
so we can have a link to them and some of the things that they've done in the show notes.
Yeah.
I want to think about as we're not at the end of our time, but we're getting closer. Turn the conversation now towards immigration in particular, because as you've mentioned, it's a huge issue in a lot of different ways, thinking about it fiscally, community-wise, for the people who are actually coming from other countries. Uh, in my experience, it seems like it could be easy to point to Donald Trump coming on the scene as this is when things changed. And it might be the case that that was like an inflection point where things like the dial got turned way up and the conversation got a lot hotter. But it does seem like things were happening before that that were sort of leading us in this direction, even just at a rhetorical level.
Yeah.
In your experience on the church side, how have churches over the last, whether it be since you've been in your role or the last 10, 15 years, been thinking about immigration? How have they been thinking about it biblically? What does, what does it look like to think about it biblically? Just what does the situation look like on the ground, I guess?
So Eric, when I started with the NAE, because us and partners have done surveys on evangelical attitudes on immigration, and probably a significant minority of people had not 30 20 30% had not ever heard a message of immigration. I think that's changing some. I had not often preached on that. So if you're just sitting in the pews on a Sunday morning, or say you're listening to Christian radio, I do find, and I love Christian radio, and but you could pretty much listen to some stations and think that the whole Christian life is just singing contemporary worship songs, and there's just no conversation about any issues of the day. And um, so part of that is just, are we really preaching and teaching the full counsel of Scripture? Do we have a holistic understanding of biblical mandates? And the other thing, I think it depends on the community, because when I was in this one community in Western Minnesota, we were like 98% white. And if there was a mention of an immigrant, it was something about, you know, uh, Islamic terrorist or something. And so there's just this fear of the unknown. When we moved to Wilmer, where we were for a while, people in our previous community would say, "Well, why are you moving there? Like, don't you realize they have problems there?" And I think that word "problem" is code for immigrants because there's a large Somali population, large Hispanic population. But that's where I began to meet people from other countries who not only were just curiosities, but they became friends. And that completely changed. So here's two communities an hour apart in Western Minnesota. One of was and is increasingly almost anti-immigrant, and the other one is just his and it was evangelicals who led the way in loving immigrants and getting to know them, treating them with respect, following the biblical call to welcome the stranger. And it's amazing. And I just found so much life in that. So I think it just kind of depends on where you are. You could be in one suburb of the Twin Cities metropolitan area here in Minnesota, and um, and find complete ignorance on immigration issues, and you could be a suburb or two away and have all sorts of immigrant neighbors and things happening. So, So I think it just kind of depends. Um, but I think that, did Trump change everything? No, this has been building for a long time. And I think part of it is because it's not the highest ever, but in recent years, there's been among the higher percentages of foreign-born people living in America. So it's just become more visible, I think, for more people. And I think there's this normal reaction of what's happening to the country I used to know. So when I grew up in suburban Minneapolis, I mean, it was probably 98% white. You only had to travel, 5 miles, and you were in parts of Minneapolis that had large African American populations, but we just didn't drive them. I mean, that was like, so, but, um, but our country's been changing some, and I think when people don't know what to do, they fill in the blank with whatever fear narrative. So, and I think we all have a call to not only welcome people initially, but incorporate them into our life and our culture and all that. And that's just hard work to do that. Um, so yeah, like you said, this has been building for a long time. Why don't you give me a follow-up question? I can maybe kind of bring this to where you want to go with it. So,
Sure. Yeah. Maybe we'll go in this direction first, and then we can marry the two
yeah.
thoughts. So we just had sort of what it looks like on the ground for Christians right now. What actually is happening at a policy level right now with immigration? Because so we're recording in the middle of August. It'll come out a little later than that.
Uh,
Not a lot is happening at the federal level at the moment because Congress is on recess. But what has happened in just the last even 6 months with immigration policy?
I I think we have been hearing for the whole time I've been on the NAE, so several years at least, um, that one party has said consistently over and over and over again, kind of almost ad nauseum, we're not going to do anything on immigration until the border is fixed. And so it's been both the reason and perhaps the excuse for inaction. And it's been really frustrating. And part of my response is, well, what do you mean by fixed? The border has never been sealed in 250 years, of the United States.
Yeah.
And millions of people cross the border every day for commerce and industry and trade and family reasons, So are you literally talking about an impenetrable wall that nobody will cross? I mean, that would be foolishness because of all these reasons, business and commerce and culture, and we would go bankrupt, So so, so like, are you being serious about this? What are you really saying? Or is there, or can it be better? Or do you want so no person ever, 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 we're down to zero apprehensions, zero crossings, and that's just not realistic. But how much is good enough? Is it, you know, um, you know, 90% of people are apprehended, or is it 80%, or is it 98%? I mean, but don't just use it as a talking point. So, and now really what has happened is one could say that we are at absolute historic lows of border crossings, and that's changed a lot I would say in the last year. It started changing in the middle of last year, um, with the previous administration. Um, is it good enough to say really the borders, for all intents and purposes, fixed? So now are we going to work on the asylum process? Are we going to work on refugees? Are we going to work on workforce issues? Are we going to work on student visas? Are we going to work on a whole host of things? What do we do with dreamers, for instance? Um, and so and so those are things that we think this is a time to tell elected officials your excuses are running out for inaction, so you need to start working on some more multifaceted immigration reform. So to that end, this back in mid-July was the third time that the Dignity Act was introduced in the House, was introduced in the last two Congresses. It has been changed some in 2025 because of the really dramatically new political realities. And so there was in that bill, it's fairly comprehensive. There was a pathway to citizenship that's been taken out now because there's just not the political appetite for that. But the Dignity Act refers to the Spanish word dignidad, which is a acronym. But basically, but it also means that we need to treat all people with dignity. And so those who've been here, they are saying people who've been here 5 years or longer um, would have some path towards legal status, some process. And so with this bill, there's actually it'd be a 7-year process with $7,000 in fines and fees along the way to be able to request a green card and have legal status. There won't be a pathway to citizenship, but which is a whole kind of another side conversation. But it also addresses the asylum process. It addresses border security, which a lot of that's already been. There's been like hundreds of millions of dollars more to border security than has ever been, and we would say is excessive. Like I don't know how they're going to spend all the money. There's so much money now for both border security and for border enforcement or immigration enforcement. Um, it's also going to address American workforce. These funds and fees are going to go to retrain native-born American workers. So for those who say they're taking our jobs, well, there's going to be a lot of money if this bill is passed to train American workers to take whatever jobs need to be taken. Um, and it will fix a number of visa issues to make sure that there are appropriate number of foreign-born workers to take the jobs that Americans just aren't taking, aren't going to take, that will support our economy and help pay down the debt. So this bill completely pays for itself, and it has some principles like treating people with dignity rather than putting people in the jungles of the Everglades. There'll be humanitarian campuses where people will be treated, for a limited time with dignity and respect. They'll have access to legal counsel, some other things that are not happening at the moment. So that's an example of something. I don't think there's a lot of optimism that even this is going to pass as good as it is. And there's 20, I think there's uh, 20 co-sponsors, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats so far in the House. It needs a companion bill in the Senate. Um, but we can point to it and say, well, there's elements if you want to break it into smaller pieces and pass it piece by piece, that's fine too. But there's still barriers because some are saying this is amnesty, but it's not. It's there's expensive process of fines and fees and people who are already here contributing to our economy. So, but there's always the fear that if we show any measure of grace, then it will encourage more people to come. And we would say, for the sake of those who need some grace, and we need them, you know, um, that's a risk we can easily take because there's plenty of border enforcement measures in place. So that's something. It's a long shot, but and I think ultimately people. I mean, to be just direct, Republicans are telling us consistently that they don't want to get ahead of the president, and so really it's going to be all sorts of creative angles. Maybe what's seen on TV or something. By the president to say, that maybe this is his opportunity to do the really magnanimous legacy sort of action that would finally fix this mess once and for all. But um, that's going to take some creative uh, advocacy, because ultimately things are increasingly top down, and Congress doesn't really want to do much. So, um, but at least we can point to things. At least we can say there are solutions. It's not an unsolvable problem. There's really good people who've come up with, this or similar bills like it, or smaller bills that work towards solutions. And we just have to be relentless about saying that the time is now. So that's the big thing. As far as other smaller pieces, I think that there's things that can be adjusted on visas through much smaller pieces of legislation. We're working on the Religious Workforce Protection Act. So if you're a pastor coming from another country and you're serving an immigrant congregation here in the U.S., because of some changes the Biden administration made on administrative policies, and now people have to go back. So they'd be right in the middle of their ministry after they're here for 5 years, and now they have to go back because the waiting line is so long for them to renew their visas. that they have to go back to their home country for at least a year. It really messes things up, uproots families, leaves congregations without pastors and workers. So, but Congress could fix that. There's a bill for that, and then we think that really working with both Congress and the State Department on restoring the U.S. refugee resettlement program is really low hanging fruit because every refugee who comes in under that refugee program is very, very, very well vetted. It's the best of the best of the best who come here to the U.S. They're processed overseas. And I think 43% are broadly Christian who come through that. And because that program has been completely shuttered at the moment, we have slammed the door on persecuted Christians and other persecuted people, but there is no way to come right now. And so that's a body of Christ issue that we need to be talking to churches about. And then we came
Yeah.
out with probably the third thing, and then is just the whole broad issue of deportations. You know, right now, I think 60 to 70%, somewhere in there. I can't remember the exact statistic, but a large majority of people who are being apprehended have no criminal record whatsoever, you know. And so even though what's being said is that they're all dangerous criminals, that's not what Department of Homeland Security's own statistics are saying. They're saying that about two-thirds are have no criminal record at all. So we're concerned about that. Our one part of the body report that came out with us, um, World Relief, Gordon Conwell Seminary, and the Catholic bishops say that 1 out of 12 Christians will either be deported themselves in the U.S., 1 out of 12, or some in their immediate families. And for Catholics, it's 1 out of 5. So
Wow.
yeah. So, I mean, it's a remarkable church degrowth strategy if you want to, got the church is through these sort of extreme deportation measures. And there needs to be better processes, better legal, um, more due process for those who are accused, because right now many are being convicted without any, deported without any hearing, any right to legal counsel, any right to object. Um, so that's problematic. But for many, that is a body of Christ issue. And of those in currently being detained, I think again 2/3 to 3/4 are Christian who are being detained at the moment. Um, so the church needs to be aware of that, and understand that one part of the body is suffering, and we can have really intelligent, long debates over the nuances of how we could fix it. But at least the church shouldn't be closing their eyes to much of what's happening right now. So,
Yeah. That's I had not fully read that report. I saw that it was there, but those statistics are remarkable to say the least. Not in a positive way.
right. Yeah.
Um, Maybe to wrap this up here, so we just had what the situation looks like on the ground for Christians and their understanding, and what the situation looks like on the ground politically. What are good ways for Christians to have a grow in their understanding of what's happening in real time, or what they should be concerned about, what's happening on the ground, and then using that idea of creative advocacy, what how should Christians be advocating when it comes to immigration?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just be informed. You can go to World Relief's website, Evangelical Immigration Table's website, our website. We have a topic section. Just click on immigration. We have statements, position papers, articles, so on and so forth. So it's just so you're educated. National Immigration Forum has a newsletter. It's just curated news sources called the Forum Daily that I know I rely on a lot to just keep up day to day with some developments. So those are some, if you subscribe to one of those things or regularly go to one of those websites, at least you'll be a little bit more up to speed. Certainly raising awareness of the Dignity Act, and whether that's the magic bullet, at least there's principles in there. And there are approaches that we think are on the right path. It's still surprising how, a bill that's been introduced 3 times and has had a number of co-sponsors from both parties. Still, there's a whole bunch of people in the House of Representatives who've never heard of it before. And so there's just always that need to raise awareness for that. Um, and a lot of prayer. is key. And I think of I mean, this maybe either shows my age or my bias, but I think of somebody who's kind of a moderate to conservative guy like David Brooks, who said, he said, I don't understand why people aren't out demonstrating in the streets, with some of the things that are happening, but he said there's just a lot of quiet deal making happening behind the scenes. Some people need to probably be out in the streets, and other people, like what we're trying to do, is quietly work with back channels. Um, it's hard for us to know sometimes if, we talk to members of Congress or their staff and they are agreeable, and yet they'll say they agree and they say they support it, but when push comes to shove and it comes to a vote, they don't vote, the way we'd want them to. So I don't know the answer to that. But again, we just need to be the mosquito in the ear, I guess, of our members of Congress, just kind of relentlessly buzzing, but in a way that they'll hear us. And I think evangelicals especially um, have an opportunity. We've had two key immigration staffers in Congress say evangelicals are the key to immigration solutions in our country, because I think they're perceived as being political, conservative, and that currently, for those who are in power, uh, we're a little more on the inside, maybe than some other groups are, and so, and nobody wants to be talked to dismissively. Nobody wants to be, shouted at, or treated rudely, and so they say,
Yeah.
how can we walk alongside you to find some solutions? In the meantime, you need to know stories of not only what the Bible says, because ultimately, we none of us will be accountable to a political leader. We'll all be accountable to the Lord. So
Yeah.
to remind elected officials of that, and also to understand that there are people in your state or your district, your voters, who are being impacted significantly by some decisions being made, and you need to know that. And there could be a political cost for that. So you kind of try all the above, with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. There's really not one magic bullet, but we, hundreds of thousands and really millions of lives are at stake, either life or death, or certainly, in significant disruptions. And we're concerned right now with Afghanis who are about to be deported back to Afghanistan, Afghani Christians to their certain death, Iranians who came here fleeing, death threats, persecution, who would be deported to their death, Haitians who, both for faith reasons, but also just simply because of just the complete collapse of society in Haiti, who the administration is saying things are fine in Haiti now. But you talk to anybody in Haiti, things are not fine at all. And so this really will be life and death for many people. And so that's why we feel called to speak up.
Yep. And to your point, we go with the Holy Spirit on this.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
so Steve, thank you for all of that. We covered a bunch of stuff, and I'm glad we were able to have you on here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.